The bustling cafe in the heart of Los Angeles was alive with chatter and the rich aroma of freshly brewed coffee. It was one of those places where people came to escape the chaos of the city, finding solace in the hum of espresso machines and the friendly banter of waitstaff. Among the patrons that day was none other than Snoop Dogg, the legendary rapper, producer, and cultural icon. Known for his laid-back demeanor and love for the community, he often frequented local spots, blending in as much as a global superstar could. Today was supposed to be just another ordinary outing for him, a quiet moment to enjoy a cup of coffee and plan his next project. But fate had other plans. In walked Tracy, a waitress who had been working at the cafe for nearly a year. Tracy was known for her sharp tongue and no-nonsense attitude. Her colleagues often joked that she could deliver a cutting remark as swiftly as she served a cappuccino. But Tracy carried a chip on her shoulder, one that often led her to treat certain customers differently. Whether it was out of bias, frustration, or something deeper, her actions sometimes crossed the line. When she saw Snoop Dogg seated near the window, casually dressed and scrolling through his phone, Tracy's expression shifted. Her lips pressed into a thin line, and a flicker of something unkind passed through her eyes. Perhaps it was jealousy, or maybe it was the stereotype she associated with someone like him. Whatever it wasn't long before her disdain began to show. Snoop Dogg, oblivious to the tension, smiled politely as Tracy approached. "Morning," he said in his signature smooth tone, glancing up from his phone. "Can I get a black coffee? Just keep it simple." Tracy barely looked at him as she jotted down the order. "Sure," she said curtly before spinning on her heel and heading back to the counter. To anyone watching, it might have seemed like an ordinary interaction, but the subtle air of hostility was palpable to those who knew Tracy well. Her coworkers exchanged uneasy glances, sensing that something was off. As the minutes ticked by, Snoop sat patiently, occasionally greeting fans who recognized him and asked for selfies. He was gracious, as always, making time for everyone. Meanwhile, behind the counter, Tracy prepared his coffee. But instead of treating the order with the care it deserved, she muttered under her breath, her movements brisk and aggressive. When the coffee was ready, she marched over to his table, her hands gripping the cup a little too tightly. What happened next unfolded in a matter of seconds, but felt like slow motion to everyone in the cafe. As Tracy approached, she stumbled, or at least that's how it seemed. The steaming cup of coffee tipped forward, spilling its contents directly onto Snoop Dogg's head and shoulders. A collective gasp echoed through the room as the rapper jerked back, the scalding liquid soaking into his hoodie and dripping onto the table. The cafe fell silent. All eyes were on Snoop Dogg, whose face was a mixture of shock and pain. Tracy stood frozen, her mouth slightly open, as if she couldn't believe what had just happened. But was it truly an accident? Or had she done it on purpose? One of the waitstaff rushed forward with napkins, while another hurried to fetch a cold compress. Snoop, ever the professional, didn't lash out. Instead, he calmly dabbed at his face and neck, his expression unreadable. "It's okay," he said to the frantic employees around him. "I'm good." But the atmosphere in the cafe was anything but good. Whispers rippled through the room as customers speculated about Tracy's intentions. Some believed it was a genuine mistake, while others weren't so sure. The tension was thick enough to cut with a knife, and Tracy's pale face did little to convince anyone of her innocence. Before anyone could confront her, Tracy blurted out, "It was an accident." Her voice was high-pitched, defensive. "I didn't mean to." But her words were cut off by Snoop's calm but firm response. "Accidents happen," he said, his eyes locking onto hers. There was no anger in his voice, only a quiet authority that made everyone stop and listen. But sometimes they say more than we think. The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken meaning. Tracy looked away, her hands trembling as she clutched the empty coffee cup. It was clear that the incident wasn't going to be brushed aside so easily. The customers, the staff, and even Snoop himself were left wondering. Was this truly an unfortunate mishap, Or had something darker just been exposed? As Snoop stood to leave, the cafe erupted into whispers once more. No one could predict what would happen next, but one thing was certain. This moment would ripple far beyond the walls of the cafe. Tracy's actions had set off a chain of events that would soon shock everyone in ways they never expected. And as Snoop stepped out into the bright sunlight, the question lingered. What would he do now? The quiet that followed Snoop Dogg's exit lingered in the cafe like a heavy fog. People whispered in hushed tones, their eyes darting between the door he had just walked through and Tracy, who stood frozen near the table where the spill had happened. Her hands shook slightly as she clutched a tray to her chest, her face a mixture of guilt and defiance. She could feel the weight of everyone's stares, like a spotlight she couldn't escape. In the corner, two regulars whispered to each other. "Did you see her face?" One of them asked, leaning closer. "It didn't look like an accident to me." "I don't know," the other replied. "But who spills coffee like that?" She practically poured it on him. The murmurs grew louder as the story spread across the cafe. It wasn't just about a clumsy mistake anymore. It was about intent. What had started as a moment of chaos was quickly becoming a scandal, and everyone had an opinion. Tracy's co-workers exchanged nervous glances behind the counter. Some of them had seen her earlier interactions with Snoop and couldn't shake the feeling that her stumble wasn't as accidental as she claimed. Tracy, still standing stiffly by the table, finally snapped out of her daze and marched toward the kitchen. She could feel her co-workers' eyes on her, but she refused to look at them. Instead, she grabbed a dish towel and pretended to busy herself wiping down the counter. Her mind was racing. She replayed the moment over and over, trying to convince herself it was just an accident. But deep down, a tiny voice whispered otherwise. She hated that voice. In the hours that followed, the cafe returned to its usual rhythm, but the atmosphere remained tense. Every so often, customers glanced at Tracy, and she avoided their eyes. She could feel the judgment in their looks, the unspoken accusations, and while she tried to act like nothing had happened, it was clear that things had shifted. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg was far from the cafe, but the incident was still fresh in his mind. He sat in the back seat of his car, staring out the window as his assistant chatted on the phone beside him. The burn on his neck had been minor, thanks to quick action with a cold compress. But the sting of the moment lingered. It wasn't just the physical pain that bothered him. It was the look in the waitress's eyes right before the coffee spilled. There was something there, something he couldn't quite put his finger on. "Are you okay, Snoop?" his assistant asked, hanging up the phone. "Yeah," he replied, his voice calm but thoughtful. "Just thinking." His assistant gave him a knowing look. "That waitress, huh? It didn't look like an accident to me." Snoop didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back in his seat, his mind drifting. He thought about the countless times he had walked into places like that cafe, just trying to be a regular guy, only to be met with hostility or prejudice. It wasn't new to him, but that didn't make it any easier. He had spent years rising above it, refusing to let other people's ignorance define him. But something about this incident felt different. It was personal, in a way he couldn't quite explain. Back at the cafe, things were spiraling for Tracy. Word of the incident had already spread beyond the walls of the shop. A customer had filmed part of it and posted it online, and the video was quickly gaining traction. In the clip, Snoop Dogg could be seen sitting calmly as Tracy approached with the coffee. The moment the liquid spilled on him, the camera captured his sharp intake of breath and the stunned expressions of the other patrons. The video ended with Snoop standing up and walking out, his hoodie stained, but his composure intact. The caption read, "Racist waitress accidentally spills hot coffee on Snoop Dogg, or did she?" Comments poured in from all corners of the internet. Some people jumped to Snoop's defense, calling out Tracy's behavior and demanding accountability. Others trying to downplay the incident, arguing that accidents happen and the whole thing was being blown out of proportion. But as more people shared their opinions, one thing became clear. This wasn't going away anytime soon. Tracy's manager, a middle-aged woman named Carol, called her into the office later that day. Carol had seen the video and knew she had to address it before things got worse. Tracy sat across from her, arms crossed and a scowl on her face. "Tracy, we need to talk," Carol began, her tone firm but not unkind. What happened today was unacceptable. Tracy's eyes narrowed. "It was an accident," she snapped. "I don't know why everyone's making such a big deal about it." Carol sighed. "Tracy, I've worked with you long enough to know when something's not right. I saw the video. Even if it was an accident, the way you acted afterward didn't help." Tracy felt her cheeks flush with anger and embarrassment. "So what? Are you firing me?" Carol hesitated. "I haven't made any decisions yet, but you need to understand the gravity of this situation. People are talking about boycotting the cafe. This could hurt all of us." Tracy sat silently, her jaw clenched. She didn't want to admit it, but she could feel the walls closing in. She had always been able to brush off criticism, but this was different. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about the cafe, her coworkers, and her reputation. And for the first time, she started to wonder if maybe, just maybe, she had gone too far. As the day turned into evening, Tracy couldn't shake the feeling that everything was about to collapse. She stayed late at the cafe, scrubbing tables and sweeping the floor in an attempt to distract herself. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the thoughts swirling in her head. Meanwhile, Snoop Dogg was at home, scrolling through his phone. The video from the cafe had popped up on his feed, and he watched it again, this time paying closer attention to the details. He noticed the way Tracy's hands had trembled as she carried the coffee, the subtle tension in her posture. And then there was the moment right after the spill where their eyes met. He could still see the flicker of something, guilt, fear, or maybe anger. It was hard to tell. He set his phone down and leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling. Snoop had always believed in giving people the benefit of the doubt, but he couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that there was more to this story. And as he sat there, the beginnings of a plan started to form in his mind. Whatever had happened in that cafe, he wasn't going to let it slide. But instead of lashing out, he decided to approach it differently. Calmly, thoughtfully, and in a way that would make people think. Back at the cafe, Tracy finally locked up for the night and stepped out into the cool evening air. She pulled her jacket tighter around her and started walking, her mind a whirlwind of thoughts. She couldn't help but feel like she was on the edge of something big, something she couldn't control. And as she turned the corner onto the quiet street, she couldn't shake the feeling that her life was about to change forever. But whether it was for better or worse, she had no idea. As Tracy walked home that evening, the weight of the day bore down on her like an anchor. The streets were quiet, save for the occasional hum of passing cars. She kept her head low, avoiding the eyes of strangers, though most people she passed had no idea who she was. Still, the thought that someone might recognize her from the video sent a wave of anxiety through her. Her phone buzzed in her pocket, but she ignored it, unable to face the barrage of messages she knew were waiting for her. When she finally reached her small apartment, she locked the door behind her and sank onto the couch. The silence of the room was both a relief and a curse. She picked up her phone and hesitated before unlocking it. Her notifications were flooded, texts from coworkers, missed calls from her mother, and a stream of alerts from social media. Against her better judgment, she opened the video and scrolled through the comments. Some were harsh, calling her a racist, a bully, and worse. Others trying to defend her, insisting it had to be an accident. But the majority of people were confused, unsure of what to believe. They wanted answers, and Tracy had none to give. She tossed the phone onto the coffee table and buried her face in her hands. For the first time in years, she felt truly cornered, like there was no way out. While Tracy wrestled with her guilt and frustration, Snoop Dogg was strategizing. He had spent the evening talking to close friends and advisors, trying to decide how best to handle the situation. His initial impulse had been to let it go. He had faced worse in his life, and he had always risen above it. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized this wasn't just about him. It was about something bigger. he decided to reach out to the cafe's management. Not to demand an apology or seek revenge, but to open a conversation. He wanted to understand what had led to that moment and, if possible, turn it into a learning experience for everyone involved. He didn't believe in tearing people down, but he also wasn't about to let the incident slide without addressing the underlying issues. Snoop had spent years using his platform to promote understanding and unity, and this felt like another opportunity to do just that. The next morning, Tracy was jolted awake by the sound of her phone ringing. She groggily picked it up and saw Carol's name on the screen. For a moment, she considered ignoring it, but she knew she couldn't avoid her boss forever. She answered with a hesitant, "Hello." "Tracy," Carol's voice was firm, but not unkind. "I need you to come in early today. We need to talk before the cafe opens." Tracy's stomach sank. "Am I fired?" "Just come in," Carol said before hanging up. Tracy spent the next hour getting ready, her nerves frayed. She walked to the cafe with a sense of dread, bracing herself for what she assumed would be her final shift. When she arrived, Carol was waiting for her in the office, her arms crossed. "Close the door," Carol said, motioning for Tracy to sit down. Tracy sat, fidgeting with the edge of her sleeve. "So, what's this about?" she asked, trying to sound casual, though her voice betrayed her. "I got a call last night," Carol said, "from Snoop Dogg's team." Tracy's eyes widened. "What? Why?" Carol leaned forward, her expression serious. "He wants to meet." He didn't sound angry. If anything, he was calm. But he made it clear that he wants to talk about what happened. Tracy felt her heart race. "He wants to meet me." Carol nodded. "I don't know what he's planning, but he said he's not interested in causing trouble. He just wants to have a conversation." Tracy didn't know how to respond. Part of her was relieved that Snoop wasn't out for revenge, but another part of her was terrified. What could she possibly say to him? How could she explain herself when she wasn't even sure what she believed? Later that day, the cafe closed early to prepare for the meeting. Tracy spent the afternoon pacing in the back, her anxiety building with each passing minute. She thought about her childhood, her struggles, and the chip on her shoulder that had grown heavier over the years. She thought about the customers she had judged unfairly, the assumptions she had made without realizing it. And she thought about Snoop Dogg, his calm demeanor, and the way he had handled the situation with grace instead of anger. When Snoop arrived, the cafe was empty except for Tracy, Carol, and a few other staff members who had stayed to support her. He walked in wearing a clean hoodie and jeans, his presence commanding but not intimidating. He smiled politely and extended a hand to Carol, who introduced herself nervously. Then his gaze shifted to Tracy. "You must be Tracy," he said, his tone neutral. Tracy swallowed hard and nodded. "Yeah, that's me." Snoop gestured to a table near the window. "Mind if we sit?" She hesitated before following him to the table. They sat across from each other, the silence thick between them. Snoop rested his hands on the table and looked at her, his eyes kind but probing. "I'm not here to accuse you of anything," he began. "I just want to understand. What happened yesterday?" Tracy opened her mouth to respond, but found herself at a loss for words. How could she explain the mix of emotions that had led to that moment? The frustration, the resentment, the snap judgment she hadn't even realized she was making. Finally, she took a deep breath. "I don't know," she admitted. "I was having a bad day. I guess. Maybe I let it get to me. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Snoop nodded, his expression thoughtful. "We all have bad days," he said. "But sometimes those bad days show us things about ourselves we don't want to see." Tracy looked down at the table, her cheeks burning. She felt exposed, like he could see right through her. But instead of feeling attacked, she felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, someone was addressing her behavior without yelling, without accusations, just honesty. As they talked, the tension in the room began to ease. Snoop shared stories about his own experiences, the challenges he had faced, and the lessons he had learned along the way. Tracy listened, her defenses slowly crumbling. She realized that this wasn't just about the coffee spill or the viral video. It was about confronting the biases and insecurities that had been holding her back for years. By the time the conversation ended, Tracy felt a weight lift off her shoulders. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt hopeful. And as Snoop stood to leave, he turned to her with a smile. "People make mistakes," he said. "What matters is what you do next." After Snoop left the cafe, Tracy sat quietly at the same table, staring out the window. The day had felt surreal, and her mind raced with everything he had said. His calm, thoughtful approach had thrown her off guard, but it had also sparked something inside her. For the first time in years, she wasn't just angry at the world, she was questioning herself. His words echoed in her mind. Asterisk, what matters is what you do next, asterisk. But what could she do to fix what she had done? The cafe staff began cleaning up around her, but Tracy remained frozen in place, her thoughts spiraling. She couldn't stop thinking about the video and how many people had seen it by now. She knew that some would never believe her, no matter what she said or did. The weight of that realization pressed down on her chest, making it hard to breathe. Carol approached her with a cautious expression. "Tracy, you okay?" she asked softly, sitting down across from her. "I don't know," Tracy admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like everything's falling apart." Carol nodded. "Look, I know things seem bad right now. And yeah, this isn't going to go away overnight. But Snoop gave you a chance to make things right. That's more than most people would have done." Tracy's eyes filled with tears she refused to let fall. "What if it's too late?" she asked, her voice trembling. "It's only too late if you give up," Carol said firmly. "You've got to decide what kind of person you want to be." Tracy spent the next few days in a haze, replaying the conversation with Snoop over and over in her mind. But the world outside wasn't slowing down. The video continued to gain traction, and the comments became even more divided. Some people demanded that Tracy be fired, while others defended her, pointing out that everyone makes mistakes. But the story had taken on a life of its own, and Tracy's name was now synonymous with controversy. Then, just as she thought things couldn't get worse, another video surfaced. This one wasn't from the cafe. It was an old clip from several months earlier, taken by a disgruntled customer. In the video, Tracy could be heard making a sarcastic remark to a group of teenagers about knowing their place. The context wasn't clear, but the tone was unmistakable. It didn't take long for people to connect the dots, and soon Tracy's past behavior was under the microscope. The backlash was swift. Articles and social media posts labeled her as proof of systemic prejudice in customer service. People began leaving one-star reviews for the cafe, even though most of them had never been there. Carol called an emergency staff meeting to address the growing crisis, and the tension in the room was palpable. "We're at a breaking point," Carol said, her voice heavy with exhaustion. "If this keeps up, the cafe might not survive. We need to figure out how to move forward, and we need to do it fast." Tracy sat in the back of the room, her face pale. She wanted to speak up, to apologize, to do something to fix the mess she had created. Every time she opened her mouth, the words caught in her throat. She felt trapped, like no matter what she said, it would only make things worse. As the meeting wrapped up, Carol pulled Tracy aside. "I need you to take some time off," she said gently. "Not because I'm firing you, but because we both need to figure out the best way to handle this." Tracy nodded numbly. Too drained to argue, she packed up her things and left the cafe, unsure if she would ever return. Meanwhile, Snoop was watching the situation unfold from a distance. He had hoped that his meeting with Tracy would help de-escalate things, but instead, the controversy seemed to be growing. He knew how the internet worked. People loved a good scandal, and once the mob got started, it was almost impossible to stop. Still, he couldn't shake the feeling that there was more he could do. He didn't want Tracy to be destroyed by her mistakes, but he also didn't want to ignore the larger conversation her actions had sparked. He reached out to his team and began brainstorming ways to address the situation publicly. He wanted to turn the negativity into something constructive, something that could bring people together instead of tearing them apart. It wasn't just about Tracy anymore. It was about the countless other people who had experienced or perpetuated prejudice, often without even realizing it. He saw an opportunity to create something meaningful, but the stakes were high and the pressure was mounting. As days turned into weeks, the tension reached a boiling point. The cafe struggled to stay afloat as the backlash continued, and Tracy found herself increasingly isolated. Friends she had once considered close began distancing themselves, unsure of how to navigate the situation. Even her family was divided. Some supported her unconditionally, while others urged her to take responsibility for her actions. One evening, as Tracy scrolled through her phone, she stumbled upon a post from Snoop. It wasn't an angry rant or a call for action. It was a heartfelt message about forgiveness, accountability, and the importance of growth. He didn't mention her by name, but it was clear he was addressing the situation. At the end of the post, he announced a live event he was organizing aimed at fostering open dialogue about prejudice and the power of second chances. Tracy stared at the screen, her heart pounding. The event was in a week, and it was being held in the same city. She felt a surge of panic at the thought of attending, but another part of her, a quieter, braver part, wondered if this was her chance to make things right. She didn't know what would happen if she showed up, but she knew she couldn't keep running from her mistakes. As the day of the event drew closer, the suspense grew. Social media buzzed with speculation about what would happen. Would Tracy make an appearance? Would Snoop call her out? And most importantly, could this moment really change anything? The air was thick with anticipation, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting for the final act to unfold. The day of the event arrived with a buzz of energy and tension that seemed to ripple through the entire city. The venue, a sleek but modest community center, was packed with people of all ages and backgrounds. Cameras from local news stations lined the back wall, and the chatter in the room was a mix of curiosity and skepticism. Everyone wanted to know what Snoop had planned. Was this just another celebrity PR stunt, or was he truly trying to make a difference? Tracy arrived early, her nerves jangling as she approached the building. She had debated with herself for hours that morning, almost deciding not to come at all. But something inside her had urged her to show up, even if just to listen. She kept her head down as she entered, thankful that no one seemed to recognize her. She found a seat near the back of the room and sank into it, trying to disappear into the crowd. Snoop entered to a wave of applause, his calm presence commanding attention as he took the stage. He began by thanking everyone for coming and sharing a bit about his own journey, how he had faced countless challenges but always believed in the power of growth and redemption. The audience hung on his every word, drawn in by his authenticity. He didn't preach or scold, he simply shared his truth. As the event unfolded, several speakers took the stage, each offering their perspective on prejudice, forgiveness, and the ways people can come together to create a more understanding world. Tracy listened intently, feeling a mix of guilt and hope. She hadn't expected to feel so moved, but the stories being shared hit close to home. For the first time, she began to see how her own actions fit into a much larger picture. Just as she was beginning to relax, Snoop stepped back on stage and made an announcement that sent a ripple of shock through the crowd. "I want to thank someone who had the courage to come here today," he said, his voice steady but serious. "Someone who's been at the center of this conversation and is willing to face it head on. Tracy, are you here?" Tracy's heart stopped. Her first instinct was to sink lower in her seat, but every head in the room turned, searching for her. The weight of their eyes felt unbearable. Her pulse raced as she debated her next move. She could leave, slink out the back door, and hope no one noticed. But deep down, she knew she couldn't keep hiding. Slowly, hesitantly, she stood up. The room went silent. Snoop gestured for her to join him on stage, and she felt her legs move almost involuntarily, carrying her forward. Her hands shook as she climbed the steps, her eyes locked on the floor to avoid the cameras and the sea of faces staring up at her. When she reached the microphone, Snoop stepped aside, giving her space. "I didn't bring you here to humiliate you. he said gently, his voice low enough that only she could hear. This is your chance to speak your truth. Tracy gripped the microphone, her palms sweaty, and took a deep breath. I don't really know what to say, she began, her voice trembling. I know I messed up. I know I hurt people, and I'm sorry for that. She paused, her mind racing. But I'm also trying to understand why I acted the way I did. I spent a lot of time blaming other people for my problems, for my bad days. And the truth is, I've been carrying around a lot of anger, of the world, at myself, and I let it out on the wrong person. The audience was quiet, hanging on her words. Some looked skeptical, others empathetic. Tracy felt the weight of their judgment, but pressed on, determined to finish. I don't expect anyone to forgive me, and I know an apology doesn't fix everything. But I want to do better. I want to learn from this, and I want to be part of the solution, not the problem. As she stepped back from the microphone, the room remained silent for a moment before a smattering of applause broke out. It wasn't overwhelming, but it was enough to let her know that at least some people believed her sincerity. Snoop smiled and nodded, placing a reassuring hand on her shoulder before taking the mic again. Tracy's story isn't unique, he said, addressing the crowd. We've all been there, making mistakes, saying things we regret. But it's what we do after that matters. That's why I'm asking all of you, what are you going to do to make this world a better place? The applause grew louder, and Tracy felt a small flicker of hope ignite in her chest. Maybe, just maybe, she could turn this around. But just as the event seemed to be winding down, a woman in the audience stood up and raised her hand. I have something to say, she announced, her voice firm. Snoop nodded for her to come forward, and the woman made her way to the stage. She introduced herself as Vanessa and revealed that she had been one of the cafe customers who had experienced Tracy's curt behavior in the past. I've been holding on to that for months, Vanessa said, her voice shaking. I never thought I'd see the day when Tracy admitted she was wrong. And honestly, I came here today ready to call her out. But hearing her speak just now, I think maybe she really is trying to change. The audience murmured in agreement, but Vanessa wasn't done. She turned to Tracy and said, If you're serious about this, prove it, not just with words, but with actions. Do something to show that you're committed to making things right. Tracy felt the air leave her lungs. She had thought the hardest part was over, but now the stakes had been raised again. Vanessa's challenge hung in the air, and all eyes were on her once more. She didn't have an answer yet, but one thing was clear. This was far from over. Tracy stood on the stage, Vanessa's words ringing in her ears. The challenge was clear, but the weight of it made her feel frozen, uncertain of how to respond. Snoop stepped forward, giving her a slight nod as if to say, Asterisk, you've got this asterisk. She took a deep breath, gripping the microphone tightly. You're right, she said, her voice steadying. Words aren't enough. I don't know what the next step looks like yet, but I promise I'll figure it out. I'll show you, not just tell you. The crowd erupted into applause, but Tracy couldn't fully process it. She left the stage moments later, feeling both overwhelmed and determined. As she sat back in her seat, a plan started forming in her mind. It wasn't perfect, but it was something. She knew she had to start somewhere. Over the next few days, Tracy began working on her idea. She started by reaching out to Snoop's team, asking for their advice. To her surprise, they were incredibly supportive and helped her refine her plan. Tracy wanted to host a community event at the cafe, offering a space for open dialogue and understanding, much like what Snoop had done. She also wanted to include a fundraiser to support local organizations focused on racial equity and education. It was a bold step, but one she felt was necessary. The cafe owner, Carol, was hesitant at first. The business was still struggling from the backlash, and the idea of hosting a public event felt risky. But after seeing how determined Tracy was, she agreed to give it a chance. This is your shot to turn things around, Carol told her. Don't waste it. As the event day approached, Tracy worked tirelessly to bring everything together. She reached out to community leaders, invited local artists to perform, and even managed to secure a short appearance from Snoop himself. Despite her efforts, she couldn't shake the anxiety bubbling beneath the surface. What if no one showed up? What if the event only made things worse? On the morning of the event, Tracy arrived early to help set up. The cafe had been transformed, with colorful banners, a small stage, and tables filled with pamphlets and donation jars. By noon, people began trickling in. At first, just a few curious faces, but soon the space was filled with a lively, diverse crowd. Tracy could hardly believe it. For the first time in weeks, she felt a flicker of hope. As the event unfolded, Tracy found herself in awe of the energy in the room. People were sharing their stories, connecting with one another, and engaging in meaningful conversations. Snoop's arrival brought a wave of excitement, but instead of taking the spotlight, he spent most of his time mingling with the crowd, encouraging people to keep the dialogue going. Then, just as things seemed to be winding down, a woman approached Tracy. She was older, with a kind but serious expression. "Tracy," she said, extending a hand. "I'm Vanessa's mother." Tracy froze, her heart racing. She hadn't expected to see Vanessa, or anyone connected to her, again. "It's nice to meet you," she said cautiously, unsure of where this conversation was headed. Vanessa's mother smiled faintly. "I wanted to thank you," she said. "Not just for today, but for being willing to face everything head-on. My daughter didn't tell you the whole story, but that day in the cafe, she wasn't just a customer. She was there with my grandson, who's mixed race. When you made that comment to her group, she took it personally. She felt like you were judging not just her, but her family." Tracy felt a lump form in her throat. "I didn't know," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry." Vanessa's mother nodded. "I believe you are, and I think what you're doing now proves it. But there's one more thing I want you to know." She hesitated, as if unsure how to continue. "Vanessa wasn't planning to come here today, but I convinced her to. She's outside." Tracy's stomach flipped. The idea of facing Vanessa again felt overwhelming, but she knew she couldn't avoid it. Gathering her courage, she followed Vanessa's mother outside. There by the sidewalk stood Vanessa, holding her young son's hand. She looked up as Tracy approached, her expression unreadable. "I didn't think you'd actually do it," Vanessa said, her tone neutral. "The event, I mean." Tracy nodded, her hands trembling. "I had to, and I want to say again how sorry I am. For everything. I know I can't change what happened, but I want to do better." Vanessa studied her for a moment before sighing. "It's not easy to admit when you're wrong," she said. "And it's even harder to make it right. But you're trying. That means something." Tracy felt tears prick her eyes as Vanessa extended her hand. They shook, a tentative but meaningful gesture. Vanessa's son tugged at her arm, and she bent down to scoop him up. "Mommy, can we go in now?" he asked. Vanessa nodded, giving Tracy a small smile before heading back inside. Tracy stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the interaction settle over her. It wasn't forgiveness, not entirely, but it was a step forward. As the event wrapped up that evening, Carol pulled Tracy aside. "You did good today," she said simply. "I think you might have saved this place and yourself." Tracy smiled, feeling a strange mix of exhaustion and relief. But just as she thought the day was over, Snoop approached her with a curious expression. "You've come a long way," he said. "But I've got one last question for you." "What's that?" Tracy asked, her pulse quickening. "Why did you do it?" he asked, his voice low. "The coffee, the attitude. Why were you so angry that day?" The question caught her off guard. She thought back to that moment, the frustration and bitterness that had bubbled over. And suddenly she realized the truth. It wasn't about Snoop, or the customers, or even the cafe. It was about her, a reflection of her own insecurities and pain. "I think I was mad at myself," she admitted, "and I took it out on everyone else." Snoop nodded, a knowing look in his eyes. "Self-awareness is the first step," he said. "Now, what matters is what you do with it." Tracy felt the weight of his words sink in. And for the first time in a long time, she felt a sense of clarity. She didn't have all the answers, but she knew one thing for certain. She was ready to keep trying. And as she looked out at the crowd one last time, she realized she wasn't alone in her journey.